Hello, board students. It's time again for writing tips on video clips. Tip number 5. Think like a scientist.
Come in, Igor. How was your anthropology class today, Igor?
Terrible! We're still working on that ethnographic research paper.
Did you finish your research?
Yes, but that just makes it worse. It's just a lot of useless observations. I don't know what I'm supposed to find out. Now he has us making lists of functions and meetings. It's totally unscientific.
You think anthropology is unscientific?
Yes. If this were a scientific project, I would have started out with a hypothesis about what I was going to find out, and then use my observations to test it. Writing the paper would have been easy. For this paper, the professor says, "What questions can you reasonably ask of your data?" Sheesh!
Igor, you fool. You are confusing deductive and inductive reasoning.
Confusing what and what?
There are at least two basic forms of scientific reasoning, Igor: deductive and inductive. Deductive reasoning takes us from facts we know to almost certain conclusions. Deductive reasoning takes us from the general to the specific. What you are calling the scientific method involves deductive reasoning. From general, well-tested theory, we construct a hypothesis. Then we use observation to test that hypothesis. For example, if a particular monkey species in one forest eats mostly leaves, and so does the same species in another forest, an anthropologist could reasonably hypothesize that the same species in a third forest will mostly eat leaves. Then she could go into that forest and observe. If the monkeys mostly eat leaves, she's confirmed the hypothesis. The most fun happens when you can't confirm a hypothesis. Then you have to figure out why these monkeys act differently than others of their species. For example, does this population have a biological condition that renders leaves undigestible? Does this forest have a more efficient competitor who eats the leaves before the monkeys can get to them? Or is it something else?
Yeah, Doc, that's just great. Only I'm not doing monkey anthropology. I'm doing people anthropology, and it's just all messed up.
Ethnography relies primarily on inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning involves reasoning from observations to more general conclusions. In inductive reasoning, one begins with observations, looks for patterns in those observations, and makes inferences on the basis of what you've observed. One then comes to a general conclusion that could be checked against more observations by you or another anthropologist. Of course, you have to be careful not to overgeneralize. Your 5 weeks of observation in one Baptist church can give you some situated knowledge about their practices. But it does not tell you much about all Baptists everywhere. For that, you would need a lot more comparative data.
So how am I supposed to analyze these observations?
Every analysis proceeds in two ways: description and interpretation. Description involves describing all the elements at your site. How many people are there? What are their ages, sexes, relations to one another? What kinds of objects do they use? Interpretation is the selective process by which the scientist makes decisions about which elements in the site to pay the most attention to.
Interpretation doesn't sound very scientific.
Nonsense. Without interpretation, you just have a jumble of facts. That is not very scientific. Think of all the things big brains like Albert Einstein have had to say about imagination. You don't think he meant the same thing by imagination that a novelist does, do you? He was talking about that crucial step where we move from a jumble of facts to analysis.
Okay. Fine. You win. Anthropology is a science. But how will any of this help me write my paper?
I'll tell you what. I'll give you 5 basic rules for writing like a scientist. Just look here. 1. Description and explanation. 2. Make claims. 3. Use evidence. 4. Make counterclaims. And 5. Define your terms. Your paper will primarily be made up of passages of description, followed by explanatory passages in which you tell your readers how to understand the description in relation to your thesis. Your argument will proceed as a series of claims you make about the significance of your data. Your thesis is one big claim, but it must be supported by other claims. Each claim must be supported with evidence from your observations and interviews. Sometimes you will recognize that your data could be interpreted in more than one way. In this case, you should openly point out these alternatives, and explain why your interpretation is the most plausible. Finally, you should define all your key terms. This includes your own analytical terms, but also any special terms used by the people you have been observing.
Thanks for the tips, Doc. Do you want me to go out and dig up some dead bodies now?
No thanks, Igor. It's getting late. Why don't you go work on your anthropology paper tonight, and we'll get an early start grave robbing tomorrow.